Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, Senior Vice President, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications. How are you, Tim?
Yeah, I am enjoying the dog days of summer and the last days of the legislative session.
That's right. So you've been following it. What's happening? Tell our listeners.
Well, this is the crunch period this week. So we're taping this on Monday morning, the 29th. So between now and the 31st at midnight, it's estimated the legislature has about 525 bills that they're going to be going through. So if you are working in the legislature or follow the legislature, well, you're going to have some late nights and a lot of fast and furious stuff. And there are some big issues that have yet to be resolved, and a lot of big things could be going down over the next 72 hours.
It amazes me that you're going to cram 500 bills to the legislature. Seems like there ought to be a much more civilized way to do things. I mean, these are big issues. The one that we've been following, and some of us have been writing about, is this, well, actually, we've been griping about it, is this scheduled shutdown of the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant. The power plant is scheduled to close, one of them in 2024 and the other in 2025. Now, Newsom wants to extend the funding to the plant, not necessarily keep it open. He wants to make sure that there is money should there be a discussion or should there be a decision to keep it open. He's proposing $75 million. Now, Tim, funny how these things come up when politicians are aspiring for a higher office. This week it's going to be 100 degrees in the Southland, and the last thing Newsom wants to do or wants to happen is to have brownouts all over the state if he's campaigning for president.
That's exactly right. That's what it's all about. And interesting enough, in his environmentalists who are, for all of Newsom's green pronouncements, they actually are not really enamored with what he is doing because he's dealing with the practical reality of just what you said. He wants to be president when before that, take a step back, he wants to be reelected. Can't have blackouts and be reelected. And as we transition to what he hopes is 100% renewable power, you can't have blackouts. So these bills are trying to take a step in that direction and have an additional power supply available, in these interim years. The irony, of course, is we need more nuclear power if we're going to have 100% renewable because it's about the most emission-free power you could have. But so we will see what happens in the next 72 hours. If that bill passes, the legislature will surely be doing so with gritted teeth.
And Tim, there's another really hot bill that you've been following on how the government could potentially be involved in franchises and raise restaurant costs.
Well, there's been a big push. As union membership declines across the country, there's been a big, of course, opposite push here in California to unionize everything, even maybe against the will of some workers. And so the latest thing is this push. It's AB 257, and it's called the acronyms of it. It's the FAST Act. And basically what it would do is it would kind of be de facto putting the state and a council of 13 unelected people who would be appointed by the legislature and the governor. So you can imagine where their sympathies will lie, and would put them in charge of setting basically wages and working conditions and other issues for franchises in California. And of course, the huge impact for that would be with restaurants. Fast food restaurants, fast casual restaurants are the most likely to be franchised. Of course, host of other businesses are franchised. Things like I use the Mr. Handyman service. That's a franchise model. So there are a lot of businesses in different areas that are franchised. So Harry Jackson wrote a great piece exploring how bad this bill would be. And I love the title of it. They said, we're about to be served restaurant closures with the side of higher prices. And it's estimated that this could boost prices at these fast food limited service restaurants between 20 and 22%. That was from UC Riverside. You could be seeing this panel push so-called living wages, which range between $22 and $43 an hour. By comparison, the minimum wage is $15 per hour. So it's a huge, it could lead to huge increases in employee compensation, which obviously customers will pay, but it's going to have many franchise owners saying, can we really make a go of it here? Maybe we don't want to have a franchise in California after all.
Yeah, Tim, and it's especially sad when so many of the small businesses and franchises haven't even recovered from COVID. A lot of them already had to shut down. So it's just going to damage small businesses even more here in the state. Well, there's another bit of intrigue happening in the speaker's office in Sacramento. Tell us about that, Tim.
Well, since summer recess, we've had this kind of simmering drama of, is Speaker Rendon going to be toppled? And as our listeners may remember, before the summer recess, there was this long Democratic caucus meeting, and Assemblyman Robert Rivas from the Hollister area emerged proclaiming that he has the support of the Democratic caucus to be elected speaker. However, usually when these things happen, there's kind of a, backslapping photo and everybody emerges and the caucus says we're uniting behind our new choice for speaker. Well, that has not happened. And in fact, Speaker Rendon is not going quietly in the night. And the intrigue of this is it really comes down to the speaker's the most important qualification for the job of speaker, and that's to count votes. You always need to be able to count to 41 votes. So while there may be more support for Mr. Rivas today in the Democratic caucus versus Mr. Rendon, what matters is who can get 41 votes on the floor of the assembly, because the speaker is elected by the entire body, not just the Democratic caucus. So to date, there has not yet been a vote. And as of this time, Monday morning, there has not yet been a vote of the assembly floor taken to elect Mr. Rivas as speaker. So that very well, who knows? We could see a vote on that over the next 72 hours or some other movement. There's one other wrinkle on this. Really, who's elected speaker would only be speaker until the end of the term, which is at the end of November. So when the new assembly comes in on December 1st, a new speaker will be elected for the new term. So some of the people who are supporters of Mr. Rivas or Mr. Rendon will not be here in December. In fact, there's going to be huge turnover. About a third of the legislature will be turning over. It's one of the biggest turnovers in the post-reformed term limits era. So we really don't have any idea who will have the votes to be speaker right now, either one of them, because there'll be so many new members coming in December. So if this is not resolved over the next 72 hours, expect it to be bubbling under the surface throughout the campaign trail and certainly right after the election. Stay tuned. It is definitely a simmering Democratic family feud in the assembly.
Well, Tim, but who do you predict will be the speaker?
I would say as of today, I put my faith more in Mr. Rendon's ability to count votes, because if Mr. Rivas had the votes, they would have taken the vote and elected him speaker. But I think we just don't know who's on what side for the class that'll be coming in November. So it could be anything, or it could be a third person we're not yet talking about. The famous speakership battle in 1980 when Willie Brown was elected, he was kind of a dark horse. There was Leo McCarthy was the incumbent speaker they were trying to take out, and Howard Berman was challenging him. They even fought it out in primaries. But Willie Brown emerged at the end of the day as a third way, and he won on the assembly floor with the votes of Republicans to get over 41 votes. So we'll see what happens.
Thanks for that, Tim. So our next podcast guest is Deroy Murdoch. He's a contributor to National Review, also to Fox News, and we're all big fans of Deroy. My mother is especially a big fan because she thinks he looks like Sidney Poitier.
Well, it's a very interesting discussion where we go through all of kind of the hot issues in, the key topics being debated in the conservative movement today, all the issues about the economy and inflation. So I think you'll all enjoy it.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. And here's Deroy Murdoch. Welcome to PRI's Next Round podcast, Deroy.
Oh, great to be with you. Thank you.
So why don't we just jump right in here and talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. So Republicans, with the help of Senator Manchin of West Virginia, have been able to thwart the Democrats' big government impulses in the last few months, but that all fell apart recently. The IRA will now become law. So what's your take on what happened? What made Manchin come home to the Democrats?
That's a good question. It's hard to get into the man's head, but I guess it was probably a couple things. One is this constant, relentless pressure they placed on him. I guess at some point you get a little tired of having your friends frown at you. So maybe that had something to do with it. He never said he wanted no bill. He did say he wanted a smaller bill. And as much as this so-called, I think, fraudulently fraudulently titled Inflation Reduction Act is expensive. I think $750 billion in total spending and taxes. It's not as big as the original Build Back Better, which I think was somewhere along the lines of 2 trillion, 2.5 trillion, some incredibly huge number like that. So I don't like this bill at all, but it's not anywhere as big as the original bill that Manchin managed to wrestle the ground and kill. I wish it were zero and not even there, but it is not as bad as it originally was before.
So pollsters and pundits have been predicting all year that it's going to be a Republican rout in November. But with the passage of this bill and the killing of al-Qaeda leader al-Zawahiri and the big jobs report in July, seems like Biden may be coming back.
I think you're right, and it's a big concern. I've heard from all sorts of conservatives over the last year, next year when we control the Judiciary Committee and next year when we do this. And there's this idea that it's baked in the cake that we're automatically going to win the House and maybe win the Senate. None of that is going to happen unless people who want to see the control of the House and control possibly the Senate switch from Democrat to Republican. People need to be working nonstop, knocking on doors, making phone calls, bringing their friends to the polls, registering voters, writing checks, all the grassroots stuff that's required to win elections has to happen. And my fear is that people on the right are just going to be complacent and just sit on their butts and think, well, we've got this locked, so we don't have to do anything. That is nonsense. That is totally untrue. And if it means that if this is a closer election than we all think, then absolutely this work is vital. And there's no downside to it. If doing the extra work means that instead of winning the House by 35 seats, we win by 45 seats and we have 10 extra seats, all the better. If it means we get, instead of winning the Senate by, if we're lucky, 1 or 2 seats, we win by 3 seats, all the better. If somebody's running for the U.S. House wins with 62% of the vote as opposed to 55% of the vote, that's an even bigger mandate, and that person has an even stronger base from which to operate. So there's no downside in doing all the work that's required to win and nothing but upside. And I think that's important because even a month ago, we had the Dow at about 29,000 or maybe just a little bit above that. We had gasoline prices climbing. We had oil climbing. We had just a much greater sense of chaos. Now, as you say, the recent jobs report wasn't a bad, actually it was a pretty good jobs report. Gasoline's been coming down pretty much almost every day or every day for the last couple of months. Same with oil prices. The inflation has gone from 9.1 year on year to 8.5, still way too high, but it's coming down rather than going up. The fact that Biden was able to sign a bill, which I think was a terrible bill, but he was able to sign something shows that, he's got a pulse. And I think every American should be happy that al-Zawahiri, the number 2 man in al-Qaeda, eventually the number 1 man once Osama bin Laden was killed, he's been blasted to bits. And that's a beautiful thing and wonderful. And very happy about that, as should be every American. And that also is something Biden accomplished. So he's looking stronger than he did before. And the idea that this GOP victory is baked in the cake is a myth, that's a fallacy. And everybody needs to get very busy, very focused, and just assume that we're 5 or 6 points behind and work accordingly.
Now, President Trump supporters have been largely winning races, and those who aren't have been losing or are behind in the polls. How powerful do you think President Trump's influence still is in the Republican Party? If President Trump runs again, do you think he'll be challenged by others? For example, Governor DeSantis of Florida, or even Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas?
I think one of the most valuable weapons a candidate can have, certainly a primary election anyway, is the endorsement of former President Donald J. Trump. We've seen a number of people come from behind in their primary races. They get the endorsement of President Trump, could be weeks before the election, sometimes a couple of days before the election. And about 92% of the people who've been in primaries have won their nominations, who've gotten endorsed by President Trump. What you hear outside is the sound of the NYPD as part of our ongoing crime problem here, unfortunately. I think if he runs for president in 2024, he's enormously popular. I think he's even more popular now after the raid on Mar-a-Lago, which oddly enough, amazingly enough, has made him a sort of a sympathetic character. It almost made him a victim. And so I think the base is even more solidly behind him than before. So if I think he runs for president, I suspect he will not be challenged, especially if the people who he endorsed in the fall do well, not just winning the primaries, but winning the general election. And if he can point to candidates he endorsed to help win the House back and maybe even win back the Senate, it'll make him look even stronger. It'll make it even harder for people who oppose him to do so. Whether he can win a general election in 2024, that's a wide open question. Who knows if Joe Biden will run, if Kamala Harris will run, or Michelle Obama, or Gavin Newsom, or who knows who might run. But I think what a lot of people on the right want is to see Donald J. Trump back in the White House, and somebody who's incredibly strong, incredibly tough, and somebody who's going to approach this increasingly authoritarian permanent bureaucracy and put these people in their place, fire a bunch of people, put a bunch of people in jail, like a lot of the top leadership of the Department of Justice and the FBI. We're continuing to engage in, I think, complete shredding of the U.S. Constitution. If I were President Trump and I got back in 2024, the first thing I would do is demand the resignation of each and every single solitary member of the executive branch. If these people do their jobs and do as they should, great. If they don't, I would take their letters of resignation out of the files, put that date on them, and say, we accept your letter of resignation. You have half an hour to clean out your desk and get out of the building. Goodbye. That's the kind of toughness we need. I don't know if Ron DeSantis would be quite that tough. I think, especially after everything Donald J. Trump has experienced over the last 6 years, I think that level of toughness has probably been built into his bone marrow now, and that's the level of toughness we need.
So let's turn to the White House. A lot of conservatives and free marketers often say that Joe Biden is sort of a hapless guy who's been captured by the progressive left of his party. But you argue against that in an article that you wrote for National Review not too long ago. So why do you think he's actually his own man?
There's this theory on the part of a lot of conservatives, which really, even though we tend to believe in personal responsibility, there's this sort of victimology theory among a lot of conservatives that Joe Biden's just a victim. He's been kidnapped by Ron Klain and Susan Rice and the other far left people on his staff, and they've taken this poor middle of the road moderate guy and they've turned him into some kind of a radical. And boy, that's just complete mythology. He is and has been a far left liberal Democrat. He has been his entire career. I always ask people, what do you believe is Joe Biden's lifelong American conservative union rating? 0 would be most liberal, 100 would be most conservative. And I have a lot of good conservatives say, I don't know, probably 40, 45. I talked to someone the other day, he said, probably a 60. So again, this idea that he's this middle of the road guy. Joe Biden's lifetime AC rating is 13. That's 1-3 across his entire, I believe, 42-year time in the U.S. Senate. So this man has been far left his entire career. He was far left working under Obama. And by the way, his last year before he joined the White House as vice president, his last year in the Senate, I believe his AC rating was 0, if I'm not wrong. He also, at several years, he actually voted to the left of Bernie Sanders, believe it or not. So this whole idea that Joe Biden's some kind of a middle of the road centrist is utter garbage. It is nonsense. It is total mythology. And I wish people on the right would take a little bit of time and look at American conservative union ratings and look at people's vote records. A lot of people, for example, Amy Klobuchar is a good example. She comes across as a wonderful sort of a PTA mom, maybe like a soccer mom, and she's very reasonable sounding and she doesn't look crazy. You look at her vote record and she has a hard left-wing vote record. So don't just look at the atmospherics and how people dress and speak. Look at how they vote, and very often you'll find that the people who folks think are moderate, they may come across as moderate, they may sound moderate, and they vote hard, solid, radical left. And Joe Biden is in that category. If he were upstairs in the Lincoln bedroom with a tube down his throat, I might believe that the White House staff took over. But he is able to get up and give speeches. He's able to get up and give press conferences. Maybe not as smoothly as President Trump, or as smoothly as President Reagan, or even as smoothly as President Obama. But he's able to get up and put sentences together and preside at meetings and answer questions from journalists. And so these are his policies. This is his agenda. This is his program. At any point he wanted, he could say to his staff, listen, this has gone too far left. We're spending too much money. Taxes are too high. We need to inject some more market principles. We need to move back to the center. We need to pivot. None of that is happening. And you see the enormous spending, including this Inflation Reduction Act, which he just signed. Border with Mexico is gone. That doesn't exist. People now are leaving, breaking into our country, getting free cell phones, free rides to various places, including now Times Square. You cross the U.S. border, you're in Times Square within a couple of days. People are getting free health care while Americans struggle to pay their health care. Energy independence is gone. The Green New Deal largely is being implemented. Joe Biden is a far left radical Democrat. His policies are being implemented by a loyal White House staff. They're doing what he wants. This is his program. This is his agenda. He's not the victim here. He is the perpetrator, and he is the author and the architect of our woes.
Deroy, but nevertheless, Biden's approval numbers are still in the 30s. It's hard to see how he's going to be running again for president. Even members of his own party are starting to waffle over a second Biden term. If you were his advisor, what do you suggest he do to save his presidency?
I think his popularity would go up very dramatically if he just did a few things. I'd be very happy if he implemented all the recommendations of the Pacific Research Institute or the Heritage Foundation or the Cato Institute. I don't think that's going to happen. But if Biden said, look, we're not going to go back to the full level of oil and gas production under President Trump, but we do have to rely on our own energy rather than Venezuela and Saudi Arabia and Iran. And so therefore, he is going to reapprove the Keystone pipeline, and he's going to allow a limited amount of oil and gas production on federal lands. And he's going to allow some amount of fracking to take place so we can have more natural gas, because if you burn natural gas, you reduce CO2 levels about 50% versus coal, for example. So that's something he could do. He could go back to re-implementing, which he just got rid of, the Title 42 on the border, which says we're able to turn anybody back because we don't want people coming in with COVID-19. He could reinstitute the stay in Mexico policy. If you want to claim political asylum or something like that, great. Stay in Mexico. We'll listen to your case. If we decide you qualify, you can come in. If not, stay in Mexico and eventually go back home if we don't let you in. On spending, if he said, look, we're going to limit spending to, maybe no more than 2 or 3% rather than just letting it rip. And we're going to keep his original promise that nobody in America would pay any tax increase if you make anything less than $400,000. And if this Inflation Reduction Act actually did that, he'd be able to say he kept that promise, even though he broke it, and people making as little as $10,000 are going to see an increase in their taxes. Again, you're hearing the NYPD running right by my apartment right now. He could do a great thing. He could have a sister soldier moment and say to these George Soros funded prosecutors, look, you don't speak for me. You don't speak for common American citizens when you take people who are victims, or I should say perpetrators of violent crime, and throw them back out on the streets. They get arrested, they're back on the street in no time. Here in New York City, we had this 16-year-old thug who was arrested for robbery. He was let go very quickly. 3 days later, he was caught on camera beating up 2 NYPD cops, and badly, not just a little punch in the arm. I mean, just walloping these guys in their faces. He was arrested. He was back on the street the next day. There's a man who went up to Lee Zeldin, the Republican nominee for governor here in New York. He went up on stage and said, I think he said, you're done or you're finished, something like that, and then lunged at his neck with some kind of a metal device trying to kill him. That guy was back on the street a couple days later. So Joe Biden could get up and say, look, the crime's out of control. I'm saying to all these George Soros funded far left, soft on crime prosecutors, this is terrible. Americans are being injured. Americans are being killed. You need to stop. And I, as the leader of the Democrat Party, am ashamed and disgusted. I want you to apply the law and take violent criminals and lock them up and keep them behind bars until they're convicted, and then throw them into prison for as long as possible. Boy, if he did those things, I think his numbers probably very quickly go from the 30s into the 40s, maybe even the high 40s. And he and the Democrats would have a much better chance of hanging on in November. I don't think he's going to do any of these things because I think he disagrees with everything I just said. And he is, again, a far left radical, probably even quasi-Marxist. And so I don't think he's going to follow any of that advice I just gave him, unfortunately.
So we, of course, have to talk about our ex-senator, now Vice President Kamala Harris. We knew as Californians what a lightweight she was for years. Well, now everyone in the nation and the world sadly knows. Are her political prospects dead? Or do you think that the media and her progressive base will continue to come to her rescue?
If Joe Biden does not run for re-election, especially if the Democrats suffer the losses that a lot of people predict and that I hope that they suffer in November, a lot of people blame Biden and try to get him out. And if he wants to run for election, nobody can stop him. I mean, he can't be kept off the ballot. So people have to challenge him and try to stop him. But if it comes to pass that Joe Biden says he's not running for re-election, obviously the next person sort of down the totem pole would be Kamala Harris. And it's going to be very hard for anybody to try to stop her because the base of the Democrat Party is Black women. And Black women are not going to be very amused if somebody comes along and challenges Kamala when she tries to become president of the United States, especially if it's someone like Gavin Newsom, who's both a male and white. And among among Democrats, those are not good things these days, as you know. I have been amazed, frankly, at how lightweight Kamala Harris is. I knew that she'd be very left-wing and she'd come in and do a lot of things with which I disagreed, but I figured she'd be kind of smooth and fairly competent about doing these terrible things. I had no idea that she would be unable to find the border for a couple of months, go down there to El Paso for just a few hours, fly away and never come back. Anytime any controversial question comes up, she bursts into hysterical laughter like a 13-year-old girl. She has this very strange tick of answering questions of a journalist by repeating the same phrases over and over and over again, almost like a verbal tick. So she's turned out to be way, way, way less competent than I expected. I think that's been really kind of a surprise to a lot of people. But again, if she wants to run for president, if Biden doesn't run, she is the vice president of the United States, for better or for worse, I think for worse. And so she's sort of next in line, if you will. And if people are going to challenge her, especially if it's someone other than Michelle Obama, who's a fellow Black woman, if it's a white guy who's going to try to deny this Black woman the opportunity to be president, there are going to be a lot of Black females in the Democrat Party who are not going to be at all amused. And if you are a Democrat nominee, good luck winning election without the support of Black women.
So, Deroy, let's turn to our own Gavin Newsom here. You're a former Californian, a Los Angelino living in Manhattan. What do East Coast liberals think of Newsom? What's your take on those ads that he ran in Florida? And what do you think are his prospects for higher office?
I think among the Democrat base, if Joe Biden doesn't run and if Kamala Harris doesn't run, I think Democrats may be very enamored with Gavin Newsom. He's he's a big guy. He's pretty well spoken. He's not bad looking. He sort of has, a presidential look, I suppose. They may find him appealing. I think non-Democrats and non-liberals will look at the mess that California faces, multiple messes California faces, from crime, from out-of-control government, from collapsing infrastructure, from outdoor mentally ill people, school system, which when I was there, I grew up in California. I had a wonderful upbringing from 1963 to 1982. I spent the first 18 years of my life up there, and I wouldn't trade them for anything. I was in California at its absolute golden age, and we had the best schools in the country. I believe the California government schools are something like 48th or 49th, almost at the very bottom of the pile in terms of academic performance, reading scores, grades, etc. Probably, I imagine California is probably somewhere at the top in terms of spending, however. So people will look at all of that and think, gee, do we want to do that from coast to coast? And I think most people will answer no. But could he be nominated by a left-wing party that appreciates somebody like Gavin Newsom, who's quite the left-winger? I think that's a possibility. But I think Gavin Newsom would be very hard-pressed given all the problems in California, which would be very, very easy for a Republican to highlight. I think that those things would make it very hard for Gavin Newsom to make it to the White House.
So you travel all over the country and you know California's blue state politics. What's the take on California by the rest of the country? Do conservatives think that we've gone off the deep end? Do progressives think that we're leaders to be emulated? Any change that will ever be Iowa by the sea again?
I doubt that California anytime soon is going to be Nebraska with palm trees, although that would be nice. I know among conservatives, there's just a real sadness. And those of us who are a little bit older who remember what California used to look like and what it used to be. You had Governor Ronald Reagan, you had Governor Pete Wilson, you had Governor George Deukmejian, you even had Governor Schwarzenegger, pretty diet Republican as far as I'm concerned, but he did have an R next to his name. You had people like, again, Pete Wilson and S.I. Hayakawa, solid conservatives in the U.S. Senate. Boy, what a difference a generation makes. California is now a far, far, far left state, maybe the most left-wing state in the country, and a very large one. It's not like Vermont, which is pretty small. This is a country that is rather a state that's enormous. It could be, I think we're a country to be something like the fifth or the sixth biggest economy in the world, I believe. And so I think there's a lot of sadness that this once great, prosperous, growing, beautiful state is now such a shadow of its former self. People still think the weather's great. They think it's a nice place to visit, but you look at everything from the out-of-control prosecutors like Chesa Boudin, who was recalled, George Gascon. I know there's an effort to try to recall him, and now they're saying that the petition signatures were insufficient. We'll see how long that lasts and if that will create lawsuits. The rampant shoplifting, the rampant crime, the congestion, sort of crumbling roads, all these sorts of things. And people look and say, what a shame that this once great state is now sucking wind in so many respects. I imagine among people on the left, they probably see these things and they're happy to see them. And they love the big government activity and the environmentalism, which has become such a religion out there, that rather than take water that is necessary to keep California irrigated and hydrated during a drought, you've got the water being pumped under the Golden Gate Bridge, I guess, to clean the pediments or the foundations of the Golden Gate Bridge, because there's this Delta smelt, this fish about the size of your pinky that needs to be protected while the rest of the state goes completely dry and goes thirsty. So people on the left may think that's a great thing, but I think anybody in the middle and certainly people on the right look at California with a sense of great sadness and increasing horror.
So, Deroy, we want to ask you a conservative movement question. There's a new wing in the movement, the NatCons or National Conservatives, that's really catching fire and raising a lot of money and bringing a lot of young people into the fold. Give us your perspective on the NatCons and their influence on the conservative movement.
Well, I think that there are people who put a real focus on nationalism, putting America first, et cetera. I think that's fine. I've heard some of these people think that the way to handle this is through a lot of taxes and redistribution. There's no need to do that. I know people use the word populism a lot, and I think that's, to me, at least in this country, is just a misnomer. People point to President Donald J. Trump and say, "Oh, he's a great populist." I think he's a very successful conservative Republican. There's no need to give a new label to what he was and may be again, which is a successful conservative Republican president. The things that he did in terms of cutting taxes, deregulation, advancing school choice, maintaining border security, peace through strength, these are conservative Republican policies and always have been. I think the only differences are that he, I would say, largely was less free trade or less doctrinaire free trade than a lot of people might be, including myself. But I think that the tariffs against China were necessary in order to get the attention of the Chinese Communist Party. I think we needed that 2x4 knocked over their heads for them to pay attention to us and stop the nonsense they were doing. Unfortunately, COVID-19 took over all of that, and the free trade agreement that President Trump negotiated with the Chinese pretty much was obviated about a month later when COVID-19 broke out. I also wish that President Trump didn't spend quite as much money as he did. I think he could have been thriftier with the spending, but the idea was basically that he went along with more domestic spending that he'd like, and the Democrats went along with more of an increase in defense spending that they would like, and that was the trade-off: is modernization of the American military at the expense of more domestic spending. You can debate that, but I think that was the rationale. But I think largely apart from those two things, his policies were conservative Republican policies, and excellent ones and successful ones. We saw the most vibrant economy this country has enjoyed since the 1950s, the lowest Black unemployment rate ever, the lowest Hispanic unemployment rate ever, I believe the lowest unemployment rate ever for Americans of Asian background, and the lowest unemployment rate for women since the days of Dwight David Eisenhower. And we have had things put into law and signed into law, such as opportunity zones, basically incentives for economic development in inner city and low-income areas. The first STEP Act, which I mentioned, is basically criminal justice reform, which allowed nonviolent offenders to have a chance to get back to their communities, and apparently a lot of them did so and did so successfully. The right to try, where people who are terminally ill have access to experimental drugs, which have not received full FDA approval. That was a wonderful thing, and that's probably saving lives as we speak. And a whole lot of other excellent steps forward that President Trump took. But these, again, and in a very good way, not as criticism, but as a positive comment, were conservative Republican policies, and there's no need to come up with populism or American nationalism or national conservatism or whatever. Free market conservative policies work, they're effective, and there's no reason to cook up a new recipe. I think the recipe is fine. It's just a matter of going out and selling it, talking about what President Trump and his ideas and policies achieved, and going out and trying to do so again in 2022 and 2024.
So finally, Deroy, it's been a while since we've had you on the podcast, and we're in the process of updating our great wine map as we celebrate next round's 5th anniversary. So what wine or beer or cocktail are you drinking these days that we can add to the next version of our great wine map?
Well, I think the idea of a great wine map is a really good one. I'll tell you about an interesting thing I found at my wine shop across the street from where I live, which is the Union Square Wine Shop, which is on 4th Avenue, 13th Street in the East Village. If anybody's coming to New York City, they've got a very nice selection of very friendly staff. I like sparkling wine. I've gotten into sparkling rosé lately, and I was going through their refrigerator to pick up some stuff to take to have some with some friends, and I found to my amazement, a bottle of sparkling Malbec, which I'd never seen before. I believe the brand is, or the vineyard's Alma Negra from Argentina. And it's basically, it looks like sparkling rosé, but it's actually sparkling Malbec. And it's light and refreshing and delicious. And I would say it had a very, very slight metallic note, if you will. Now, that may sound terrible, but if you've eaten truffles and truffle oil, there's a little bit of a metallic taste to that, which is actually not bad. And I found just a hint of a metallic sense to this sparkling Malbec, which I really enjoyed. I'm also a beer drinker. I like the taste of Belgian whites and that sort of thing. Hoegaarden's wonderful. I enjoy that. And then among similar American beers, I'm a big fan of Blue Moon. And I think even slightly better than Blue Moon is Shock Top, which is basically Anheuser-Busch's answer to the Blue Moon product. I think Shock Top is a little bit of a hint of orange, which I like a little better. And certainly from your area, I've always been a big fan of Anchor Steam, which is a terrific beer. My only objection is they took a wonderful, beautiful label they have had for many decades, if not a century, and put on a new label, which is kind of bright yellow and kind of gaudy. So I wish they go back to the original label, which I liked a lot better. And then last but not least, I'd say that I'm really not much of a spirits drinker, but in the last couple of years, I've become a fan of high-end tequilas, posados, and things of that sort, and things like high-end Don Julio and some of these sort of silver level tequilas really taste great, and I sip those neat rather than make big drinks out of them. And they taste great. They have a nice effect, and they usually don't give you a hangover the next day. So you're able to enjoy all of the fun and few of the consequences. So those are just a few suggestions I'd make.
I have a thought for you, Deroy. One of our board members is a part owner of Tears of Llorona, and that's a delicious tequila. So might want to check it out.
I like that.
So thanks so much, and appreciate you on the podcast.
It's great to be with you, and I love all the work that Pacific Research Institute does. I've been friends with Sally Pipes as well as you guys for many years, and I admire your work, especially being in San Francisco and on the West Coast, where unfortunately a lot of our ideas, they're very much welcome, but not, I should say, very much needed, but not all that welcome. But California doesn't turn itself around soon. I think more and more people will be turning to the Pacific Research Institute and saying one word, which is help.
Thanks so much, Deroy.
Thanks very much. Bye now.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.